Westminster's used to loud demonstrations. On this issue, mostly eerie silence. Broken by the 9:30 chimes that marked the start of the momentous debate.
I call Kim Leadbeater.
The backbencher promoting the bill said hundreds of terminally ill were already ending their lives, but by gruesome means.
I have been astonished by the number of people who have been in touch with me to tell me about their terminally ill loved ones who have starved themselves to death out of desperation, something which takes far longer than you may imagine and is just horrific for everyone involved.
One Tory opponent described her proposals in lurid language.
The likelihood is that we would see this new branch of medicine spring up, like the medics I met in Canada. I will in a moment. These medics I met in Canada, specialists in assisted death, who personally kill hundreds of patients a year in their special clinics. And if honourable members have a difficulty with the language, then I wonder what they're doing here. This is what we are talking about.
As the vigils continued outside, critics and supporters of the bill shared emotional stories from their professional lives in medicine and their own family experiences.
My daughter Maria lived her life with severe disabilities and health conditions, and since her birth, we were told many times that she might have only 6 months to live. She lived for 27 years. Crucially, Maria was non-verbal, and I am filled with dread and fear for those other people like Maria.
When my daughter was very ill a few years ago, and I had not intended to speak about this today, but she was admitted to hospital with acute pancreatitis as a teenager. So this bill would not have covered her at that point. But I did not know for 5 days, in fact many months, whether she would live or die. And those first 5 days she did not sleep and she did not eat and she was crying out in pain. But I saw what good medicine can do, that palliated that pain.
I have seen uncontrollable pain, choking, and I'm sorry to say, the frightful sight of a man bleeding to death whilst conscious as a cancer has eaten away at the carotid artery. We are shortening death, not life, for our patients. This is not life or death. This is death or death.
Opponents said the most vulnerable could be coerced into ending their lives by relatives.
Robust safeguards for the sick and dying are absolutely vital to protect them from predatory relatives, to protect them from the state, but above all, to protect them from themselves. There will be those who say to themselves they don't want to be a burden. And I can imagine myself saying that in particular circumstances.
Many said they would back the bill now, but it must be improved, and the government would have to make sure it gave up parliamentary time for that.
This bill is more important than most of the bills in your manifesto. And I'm not trying to be rude. More people care about this than they care about most other things we're doing. So it deserves 4 days in report stage, in government time.
Division, clear the lobbies.
The victorious side in a packed Commons normally cheers. Today there was silence.
The ayes to the right, 330. The noes to the left, 275.
But campaigners allowed themselves some congratulations outside.
Oh, yeah. Where? You want to do it in the middle, in the middle of everyone? Oh, yeah, of course it will. Let me just speak to Esther Ranson.
Yes,
Hello. Esther, thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye, bye-bye. She's just... Oh, gosh. Hello.
Are you wrung out?
I'm tired. I'm emotionally drained.
Some people lent you their support today, didn't they, to see where this goes?
Yeah.
They
did.
They might withdraw it.
No, absolutely. And I've got a huge amount of respect for colleagues like David Davis and Marie from Penistone and Stocksbridge. You know, amazing people who have got reservations and are slightly nervous, but want the process to play out.
A bill that's been the property of its campaign leaders can now be rewritten by a much wider circle, including the government, and may today have taken a historic step towards changing the way the terminally ill, judged close to death, choose to die.
Well, that majority of 55 for the bill, a bit bigger than some of the supporters of the bill thought they might be getting only a few days ago, they acknowledge was in part brought over to their side because of the promise that this was a bill that would be changed, that would be, in the views of some of the people they were trying to woo over, would be getting additional safeguards inserted into it. So it's not absolutely guaranteed that it can coalesce exactly the same majority when it comes back to the Commons at a later stage. One of the interesting things about the Bill Committee that it moves to in the coming weeks and months is that a government minister sits in there, and although this remains very much a private member's bill, government ministers start inserting amendments by agreement, but governments don't want bad law passing on their watch, and so governments take over a little bit of ownership of a bill like this. And there were 40% of members of the Labour PLP in there who weren't happy about this bill, and some of them worry it will attract a lot of dissent in the country, animosity. But it's what Keir Starmer wanted, it's what he voted for, and for now it's what he's got.
Thanks, Gary. Well, just after the vote, I caught up with two MPs from either side of the argument, Danny Kruger, who's one of the leading opponents of the bill, and Marie Tidball, who voted for it. And I began by asking Marie Tidball how she was feeling about the result.
I think I'm feeling a great sense of responsibility. That doesn't end with the vote happening today. For many of us, it was a difficult decision, a decision I only reached on Wednesday from really searching the depth of myself to understand how I was going to vote and to read in a great level of detail the correspondence that was sent to me by my constituents. And that's ultimately, across those things, how I made my decision.
You spoke with great power about your personal experience. How important was that?
That was crucial. I'm very well aware of the arguments on both sides in a lot of detail, which is why I was finding the decision so difficult. And I had to search back to my childhood, where I was in body plaster in Sheffield Children's Hospital in excruciating pain following major surgery, itching because of the level of morphine that I was on, and I asked my parents to die. And that made me reflect back that I have lived a good life, a fulfilling life. I would never have voted for this bill if it was about suffering, but it is a very restricted focus on terminal illness. And that experience, therefore, also made me reflect on how I would want to live my own death. And I would want to live my own death the way I've lived my life, with choice and control over my decision making, and to live that with great respect and dignity. And that's ultimately how I made my decision today.
Danny Kruger, I mean, you have campaigned on this and spoke on this for so much time now. I mean, is this a terrible day for you?
Well, I'm very disappointed that we lost, but I was encouraged by the debate itself. It was a very good debate, and actually what Marie was just saying there was reassuring to me as well, and her speech was really good. And a number of colleagues who voted for the bill have made the same point, which is they recognise there are real dangers with this bill if we don't get it right. And I'm not speaking for Marie, but I think a lot of others did vote, as it were, conditionally. They said they recognise there are problems with this bill, they believe it can be improved in committee, and if it can't be, they'll vote against. And I hope that's what happens. We either have to improve this bill, because it's full of dangers, both for immediate patients, as it were, who could be dragged into the scope of the bill, but also for our society as a whole. If we can improve the bill, then I'm sure that colleagues will want to support it, but if we can't, then I hope that they'll recognise we shouldn't let it pass.
I mean, Marie's example of her own childhood is precisely the kind of thing you've been talking about. I mean, how have you come to a different conclusion as to what would happen in that scenario?
Well, I don't want to speak for Marie. I mean, my view is that we have to have real concern for people with disabilities, for the frail, for the lonely, for people with mental health conditions who could find themselves under either external or perhaps more likely internal pressure to end their lives because they don't feel that their life is worth living anymore, and they would be able to qualify for an assisted death under this law if they could convince a doctor that they have got 6 months to live, which is an impossible thing to prove definitively. So I'm afraid there are loads of dangers with this bill, but I think we all have the same concern. How do we support the people who quite naturally have real fear about a bad death? And also, how do we look after the vulnerable and avoid them being dragged into scope?
Marie?
Well, for me, I do believe that it's very tightly drawn around adults with 6 months terminal illness. Otherwise, I would not have voted for this bill. So I think that just has to be really clear. I think the safeguards are the strongest in the world. And there is an opportunity here, and I said this in my speech. We've had 10 years since the last vote. Nothing has moved forward on palliative care or end-of-life care. And as I said, it is incumbent on everybody, however they voted in that space, to make sure that now palliative care, end-of-life care and adult social care is at the top of the agenda.
Various people called on the government now to give this bill effective government time for proper scrutiny at the report stage and the sort of the parliamentary procedure. Would you echo that and say that you know, this needs more time than it would normally get?
I think that that's a decision for the government. I've been deeply reassured by Kim on the amendment that she made today around ensuring that we can listen to oral evidence and witnesses and take other reports as well in the process of the Bill Committee, and is keen to ensure she talks, as she has done, to colleagues across the House about the amendments that they would need to see, including my own, to vote for it at the third reading.
Danny?
Let's see whether the government's prepared to give it more time. I think it is important that we can take evidence at the committee stage, which doesn't always happen, so that is encouraging. I think we should have been taking evidence before we voted for it today, but there we are. There's a whole lot that needs to be done. I'm not that confident we're going to have enough time to do all the work that this bill would require. There's so many aspects of it that are unsafe, and Marie's right that in principle it's the toughest safeguards in the world. They're still incredibly weak. I mean, there's no obligation on a doctor to properly examine whether anybody's been coerced. The judge can hold their session in secret. They don't even need to meet the patient. They don't need to do any investigation of their own. So this bill is very, very weak and dangerous at the moment. So if we can improve all of that, I'll be very, very pleased.
I mean, this feels historic though, doesn't it?
It's certainly an important moment, and I think it's a great credit to colleagues across the House for taking this so seriously and ensuring we had the tone of debate that we had. And as I've said already, there is a great duty on all of us to ensure that that is a very real choice and that we're all doing what we can to improve palliative, end-of-life care and adult social care going forward.
Marie Tidball, Danny Kruger, a reminder of our main news tonight. In an historic vote, a bill to legalise assisted dying in England and Wales has passed its first parliamentary hurdle after MPs voted to approve it on its first reading by a majority of 55. The bill, put forward by Kim Leadbeater, will face more votes and closer scrutiny in both Houses of Parliament before it can become law. Well, today's vote only applies to England and Wales, and as we heard earlier in the programme, it still has many hurdles to pass before it becomes law. But it's under discussion in other parts of the UK too. Scotland is also currently looking at an assisted dying bill for the terminally ill who have been resident in Scotland for at least 12 months, with the first key vote expected next year. In the Isle of Man, an assisted dying bill is progressing. It's likely to receive royal assent next year for residents who have 12 months left to live but have been living on the island for at least 5 years. In Jersey, a bill was passed this May to legalise assisted dying for terminally ill residents who, like the UK, have 6 months left with some exceptions, and also for those whose incurable diseases cause unbearable suffering. Draft legislation is expected by the end of next year, with the law coming into effect in the summer of 2027. The only place not looking at some form of assisted dying law in the UK now is Northern Ireland. Around 300 million people worldwide live in countries which have legalised assisted dying, starting with Switzerland in 1942. It includes Canada, where assisted deaths now account for 4% of all deaths. Well, two people with in-depth experience of end-of-life care join me now in the studio. Reverend Canon Valerie Plum, whose personal experience of caring for her mother informs her decision to support assisted dying, and Dr. Rachel Clark, who is a palliative care doctor. Reverend Canon, I mean, how do you feel tonight about this first vote? I mean, it's not law yet, but it's well on its way.
I think I feel absolute relief. I feel relief in the knowledge that other families might not have to go through what we went through, that there could be a real chance of change, and I hope that's what's going to happen.
I mean, without prying, you've written about what you went through. I mean, give us a sense of what it is you're trying to avoid.
When you're faced with a situation where your loved one is desperate for pain relief, for time to just let go and move on from this life, and you can't give that to them. I don't know. I was in a situation where my mother said to me, I'm not afraid to die, but I am afraid to suffer. And she suffered. The palliative care system didn't work for her. And I wouldn't want anyone else to ever go through what we went through as a family.
Dr. Clark, I mean, you work in palliative care.
Yes.
But you're opposed to this.
I'm opposed to this change happening now, and that's not in any sense because I'm not deeply compassionate about the case of Reverend Cannon's mother, all the cases like that, and I understand what motivates the vote today is compassion and the desire to alleviate suffering. I think that the predicament for those of us who work in palliative care, and I've cared for thousands of patients approaching the end of their life, is that the real world right now is one in which palliative care services are failing patients because they're underfunded, they're understaffed, they're a threadbare patchwork quilt. Wes Streeting himself admitted this. He said, the reason I'm voting against is because that lack of care might coerce patients into feeling their only option is to take their life because we're not giving them the care to make their life work.
And do you think that's why there is such public support for this? Because of the failure in palliative care rather than support for assisted dying?
Yes, I do in part. I'm not the kind of doctor who ever pretends something is the case that isn't, and there will occasionally be cases of intractable suffering that we palliative care specialists find very difficult to treat. I have to say they're very uncommon, but I am part of a specialist palliative care team, and our entire raison d'etre is to support the whole patient, not just with pain, but finding a way to live.
And many of the people who choose assisted dying will be doing it from a position of being in palliative care, if this goes through. So how do you feel about being drawn into the process?
Well, I think that actually, if we had robust palliative care, then many, many fewer people might feel as though this is their only option. I genuinely believe that. And I appeal to Wes Streeting, in a sense, to put his money where his mouth is. He has said patients will be coerced into taking their life through lack of care. Well, he's the Health Secretary. Wes Streeting, what are you now going to do about it?
In your submission, Reverend Cannon, you said this was not about palliative care.
This is more about people having choice, and some people don't want to do palliative care. Some people don't want to go onto the journey where, whichever way you look at palliative care, at some stage, people may lose the loss of their bodily functions or their limbs and actually their dignity. So it's something more than just palliative care here. This is about taking a person and saying, this person needs choice, how they end this. Because when we talk about losing a life here, is it a life when you're somebody who's that full of despair and desperation? I would say no.
And what's your answer to people who say, well, doesn't your, I mean, here you are as a Reverend Canon, don't most Christians believe, in the sanctity of life and that the only person who can take life is God?
Well, I think if people believe that, that's up to them. But, we don't know the mind of God. What's to say that this isn't part of God's journey for us to be able to say to people, we want to give you a chance to not feel this level of unnecessary suffering. I say to people regularly that this is about love and compassion. It's not about anything else, just love and compassion. And when you're faced with your loved one saying, please help me, where do we go with that?
Well, the crux of the issue is right there, unnecessary suffering. Right now in Britain, there are thousands of people who are suffering unnecessary pain, unnecessary loss of dignity, their life shrinking to them, feeling as though they're nothing but a burden to society because we are not giving them the care they need.
Do you think ultimately, if this does go ahead and it's on the road, what will it mean for the hospice movement? Will you shrink because these will now be dealt with in hospitals? Well, or will you need to grow to deal with it?
We may be in a very peculiar situation where we have a state-funded dying service, but we don't have a state-funded palliative care service because right now, a third of the palliative care that patients need is provided by the NHS.
And will you do it, or will you opt out?
I think the doing it, the actual handing over the drugs is almost the least controversial bit of this. Right. The difficult bit is really trying to understand if a patient wants to do this or are they being coerced by the lack of care, lack of dignity they have.
Thank you both very much indeed for joining us.